Hello, everybody, and welcome to our course on the Norman Kings of England. Of course, before we begin discussing this absolutely fascinating period of history, there are a few required introductions. There are always required introductions. Basically, before we can properly understand the Norman conquest of England, we need to first have a sense of the political situation in England and northern France. That's going to be the subject of our first two modules. This module is going to deal with an introduction to the Kingdom of England, while the next module is going to give us the background for the Duchy of Normandy. After that, we can move on to William the Conqueror himself. This first module consists entirely of material which will be covered far more exhaustively in our course on Anglo-Saxon England. If you're already well read on Anglo-Saxon England, you probably won't find much in this module that you didn't already know. But having said that, I do still believe this is an extremely helpful and necessary introduction for most people who are watching or listening to this course. There was a tremendous amount of political and dynastic chaos which created the opportunity for William to conquer England, and we're going to give a brief account of all that in this module. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about the Kingdom of England itself. The first thing we need to understand is that, although England was by now a unified kingdom, and had been so for quite some time, it was by no means politically or ethnically homogeneous. Until the 9th century, there had been multiple Anglo-Saxon kingdoms on the island, as well as the native Cornish to the southwest. This political fragmentation, combined with an uneven distribution of native Britons and Anglo-Saxons, and exacerbated by successive waves of Scandinavian settlers and conquerors, led to a tremendous degree of genetic and cultural diversity within the Kingdom of England. Pursuant to that, there were a number of different regions within England, and in each of these regions, things were done differently. There were different laws, different models of kinship, and different social rankings. While Wessex was politically dominant and the unquestioned heart of English political activity, regional traditions remained strong throughout the entirety of the Kingdom of England. The main regional divisions were based on the old kingdoms of England. There was Wessex in the south, Mercia in the West Midlands, and then the Danelaw, or the lands once held by the Danes, in East Anglia, the East Midlands, and the north. And even within the Danelaw you had further divisions, since the Scandinavians didn't necessarily replace the old Anglo-Saxon institutions, rather, they simply modified them. Accordingly, the fusion of Norse and Northumbrian culture would have looked substantially different than, say, the prevailing culture in Danish East Anglia. You also had a part of Northumbria which never fully joined the Danelaw, but rather remained a semi-autonomous rump state, controlled by Anglo-Saxons, but subservient to the Danes. They kept many of the political and social structures of the ancient Kingdom of Northumbria. This paints a picture of a fragmented and decentralized kingdom. However, and this is the key here, despite these numerous local particularities, we need to realize that this wasn't really the case. Compared to the other Western European principalities of the time, the Kingdom of England was extremely centralized. Centuries of unification under the House of Wessex had solidified a sense of Englishness among the people, and even if that unity occasionally came under severe strain, it still held up. Yes, local laws varied greatly across England, but these disparate regions and cultures were still tied together into a single effective realm. And a lot of that national unity can be attributed to the relative weakness of the English nobles, So we're going to take a moment to describe who those nobles were and what sort of power they wielded, as well as the differences which existed between them and their continental counterparts. There were two basic levels of nobility in late Anglo-Saxon England: earls and thanes. Neither of these classes of nobles held their titles and lands in their own right, like, say, the French dukes, but rather held their titles by grant of the king. That meant that technically, no noble rank passed automatically from father to son, although in practice, by this point in time, they almost invariably did. What's more, there does seem to be some sort of hereditary recognition that was granted after 3 subsequent generations of nobility, although the nature of that legal recognition is extremely murky. What is clear, however, is that the English nobility owed a tremendous amount to the king and were largely dependent on him for the continuation of their status. With that being said, we'll begin our discussion with the thanes, or the lower level of nobility. These were men of property who were bound in personal service to their lord, who was frequently the king. Often, they would be granted estates and privileges by their lord as a reward for good service. In return, the thanes would attend to their lord personally, fight with him in battle, and fulfill the administrative duties required for the maintenance of their estates. There were 2 basic types of thanes: royal thanes, or thanes in the service of the king himself, and medium thanes, who served a vassal of the king, whether that was a bishop, an earl, or even a very powerful royal thane. Naturally, the royal thanes were considered to be of a higher social class than the medium thanes, but in substance, both types of thanes had the same sort of duties: personal attendance and fighting. The only difference between them was whether those duties were owed to the king himself or to one of his vassals. That's in an abstract sense. In a practical sense, thanehood had as many levels as there were thanes. Some thanes were owners of vast estates and capable of fielding dozens, if not hundreds, of retainers in battle, while others were little more than upwardly mobile peasants who had managed to scratch together the required amount of property to qualify for thanehood. Thanehood was sufficiently broad as to encompass a broad range of Englishmen, some of whom mattered a great deal, and some of whom were entirely irrelevant. The thanes, royal or otherwise, comprised the vast majority of the Anglo-Saxon nobility. On the eve of the Norman conquest, there was somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 thanes throughout England. But there was a small group of nobles who held far more power than even the most powerful thane: the earls. Originally known as ealdormen, the earls were essentially royal governors of various regions throughout England. As the power of the Anglo-Saxon monarchies grew, so did their responsibilities, and at a relatively early point it became clear that there was no way the king could do it all himself, even with his thanes. Hence, the ealdormen. The position of ealdormen had its origins in Wessex at a relatively early date, and spread north to Mercia following their annexation to Wessex. In short, the ealdorman was a royal governor, responsible for the maintenance of order, execution of justice, and defense of his jurisdiction. In essence, he did the king's job in the area under his jurisdiction. The ealdorman's position was not necessarily hereditary, and indeed, although the office was often handed down within a particular family, it remained potentially revocable, although that was not a frequent occurrence. Initially, the ealdorman was only the governor of a single shire, what we know today as a county. However, in the aftermath of the Danish invasions of the 9th century, many of England's old aristocratic families were decimated, which meant that from then on, the ealdormen were generally not from established families. This shift from established dynasties to relative newcomers greatly weakened the ealdormen's power, as a large part of the ealdormen's efficacy hinged on them being able to marshal powerful networks of clients and friends to come to their assistance. These new ealdormen simply didn't have that old boy network. What's more, as the Kingdom of England grew to encompass all the former Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, it became clear that the old system of ealdormen was not going to work on this new and large scale. There were just too many counties, and what was more, some wild areas in the north had never even been shired. In response to these concerns, King Knut, who we will of course talk about later on in this module, completely revamped the office of ealdorman, which he renamed Earl, after the Scandinavian Jarl. Instead of having many ealdormen who each controlled a single shire, Knut appointed a few trusted earls to each control a vast swath of territory, generally corresponding to the old Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Thus you had the Earls of Mercia, East Anglia, Northumbria. Wessex was temporarily kept by the king for himself, as well as several other more minor earldoms. These earls were entrusted to govern their respective territories in the name of the king, and to defend their lands in the event of invasion. Technically, this wasn't as much of an innovation as some may believe. In the past, one did occasionally find extremely powerful ealdormen who held many counties and who were known as earls, such as Elfhere of Mercia in the late 10th century and Edric Striona in the early 11th. But even so, it was Knut who really formalized the new reality, that the earls would govern a much larger amount of territory than the ealdormen traditionally had. Of course, the creation of these earls, who were essentially ealdormen on steroids, required that a new royal position be created on the county level to manage the king's day-to-day responsibilities in the shires. The men who filled this new position were known as Shirgerefas, or shire reeves, a term which has come down to us today as sheriff. The shire reeves were entrusted with all the low-level work of royal administration done on the shire level, while the earl exerted broad powers over the entire region. Shire reeves existed before Knut's reforms as well, but now they gained significant importance to royal administration. This shift in the earl's responsibilities brought both advantages and disadvantages to the crown. It was advantageous because it made royal governance that much more efficient, and there were fewer powerful interests jockeying at court. But there was a downside to this development as well. Formerly, an ealdorman may have been powerful, and he may have commanded a network of patronage and alliances, but ultimately he was only one piece in a much larger system. No single ealdorman was indispensable or too powerful to restrain. Now, however, with the advent of the far more powerful earls, the possibility of the earls becoming too powerful for the king to control was all but guaranteed. Indeed, we're going to see later in this module that by the time of the Norman conquest, pretty much all of England was controlled by two major families, the houses of Godwin and Leofric. Ultimately, the authority of the English crown was greatly weakened by this expansion of the earl's power, even if the authority which it retained was made far more efficient. But even with these new powers that they accrued, the Anglo-Saxon nobility never quite achieved the degree of autonomy that their Norman counterparts had. Why? Well, there are two main reasons for that. The first reason, which we've already touched on above, was that the English nobility did not hold their lands and titles in their own right. This gave the king a lot more leverage over his nobles than he would have otherwise had. On the continent, meanwhile, hereditary succession was the unquestioned norm, and a king or a duke couldn't just interfere with the succession willy-nilly. And the second reason, the most important reason, was that the English earls may have held extensive lands, but those lands were neither contiguous nor easily defensible. The king and his vassals held estates all throughout their vast earldoms, and accordingly, the king would have had multiple staging points from which to put down any revolt by a recalcitrant earl. In addition, the Anglo-Saxons never really got into the habit of building castles to control the countryside, which meant that any invading army would be able to move swiftly and efficiently through the rebellious noble's territory. By contrast, in Normandy, every noble had at least one castle, most had even more. These castles were situated in strategic locations to control critical roads, river crossings, and hilltops, and served as bases from which mobile cavalry forces could range out and control the countryside. This gave the Norman nobility the ability to defend themselves in depth, to wear out an invading army by attrition, forcing them to maintain numerous costly sieges, all while their manpower was melting away. Thus, a Norman lord was able to defy his liege lord with relative impunity, knowing that unless he really pushed too far, his lord wasn't going to engage in a grueling military campaign to punish him. But anyway, that was the way in which the king and nobility related to one another in mid-11th century England. Now that we've discussed the conceptual framework, we're able to move on and give a brief overview of the tempestuous political events which roiled late Anglo-Saxon England.